Welcome to the podcast, where something is amiss, something is a mess, and we'll discuss some things MS, multiple sclerosis. This podcast is meant to tell the stories of those living day to day with MS, from before they were diagnosed, getting that diagnosis, the aftermath, and where they are today in their journey with multiple sclerosis. And now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to Some Things MS. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Some Things MS, where we're talking to people from all over the spectrum that are involved in this cause, people with MS, people who are supporting those living with MS. And today, I'm super excited and happy to have a guest who's working behind the scenes in the research side of multiple sclerosis, just to talk about some of the things that he's involved in, kind of how the process works around funding research, and just, really going to learn a lot about what's going on here locally, and maybe even beyond, just, in regards to ongoing studies and things that he's learned. So welcome to the podcast, Andrew Hagan. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me. Appreciate you having me on. Excited to talk about research in MS.
Yeah, man, it's an exciting thing. I talked about this in my own journey podcast, but when I started this MS journey, it was 2004, and there was only 3 medications, maybe 4, but really 3 medications available for treatment. Yeah. And that was just compared to where we are today is incredible. Yeah. And just the breadth that's just in what's happened in basically 20 years. So what you're doing is so important. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump into some of the meatier details of what we're going to be talking about.
For sure. So I am a PhD candidate at Colorado State University. So I'm finishing up my PhD, and I do a lot of research in MS. That's entirely what I do, actually. So before I was here, I worked at places like Cleveland Clinic and Mayo Clinic, and focused on other types of research as well, in Parkinson's disease and just movement in general, how we move, how our brain coordinates our movement. So that's really where my expertise comes in. And in my PhD, I've been working in an MS research lab, and it's been a really great time. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. And so, yeah, we're right here. You're actually coming out of CU. Go Rams. Love the campus up there. Yeah. The Bike MS Ride has been using the CSU campus for years now for a stopping off point. Talk a little bit about CSU's commitment to the neurology department and what it does, just on a day-to-day, like you said, it's focused on neurology and MS. Just kind of break down what the lab does just holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do a variety of different things, mostly all focusing on MS. So in our research lab, we're called the Sensory Motor Neuroimaging Lab. So put that all together, the sensory motor system is what's affected in MS. So how we feel things and how we can actually have our brain tell us what to do, how to move. And then also what's the brain doing as a part of that process is what we're interested in. So overall, we do a lot of different studies in how do people with MS move, how do they balance, how do they walk, and how does that correlate to what their brain looks like in terms of its structure, its function, things like that. And then additionally, we look at a bunch of different stimulation techniques as well too. So we do some things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is where we can actually send pulses through your brain to understand the tracks in your brain and how it talks to your muscles. And we also can measure what your activation looks like in your brain as well too. And we also do some peripheral nervous stimulation as well to sort of stimulate your muscles and see what happens in the brain as a function of that as well too. So we're really interested in how the brain controls movement, specifically in MS, and where those deficits are in MS specifically, and what we can do to potentially improve and rehab those things through some paradigms we have as well.
Yeah, how many people are in the department? I'm sure it obviously shifts as people come in and out of school there, but how many people generally are working in the department?
It's a great question. So there are, and the department's pretty broad. So there's a lot of different research going on in our department. There's some cell research, some mouse research. There's plenty of other research in humans as well too. Our lab is most specific in MS in particular. Our department probably has about 25 faculty. We're the health and exercise science department. And we have probably about 30 graduate students and a bunch of undergraduates. The grad students are usually the ones that are working on the research with the faculty as well too. So in our research lab right now, we have 3 graduate students, 1 postdoctoral fellow, which is someone who has their PhD and is now kind of continuing their expertise and is a leader of the lab. And then we have 5 undergraduate students specifically working on our research studies as well too.
Cool. How often does it occur that somebody comes in, whether they're graduate, undergraduate, or faculty, that they have a close connection with MS, or that's the driving factor for the reason they are pursuing this career? Or this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends, but I would say in general, it's hard to find people that don't have some sort of connection to MS at this point, just in terms of incidents and how many people know other people that have either experienced it or they have a friend who knows somebody that has MS. There's a lot of, it's becoming more and more common, unfortunately, but that allows us for more passion to pursue our research.
There was not too long ago, there was a bump in the number of people they suspected have MS just in the United States. It went from, I can't remember the number, but it was low. It went to like a million or plus people living with MS. They just kind of course corrected a number that had been out there for a long time. So you're right. It's hard to not find somebody. It just, in my, once I was out there with a diagnosis, it was quite often like, oh yeah, my aunt has this, my uncle has this, my sister, my brother, oh my gosh, I have it too. I just haven't really told anybody. That just so many people that do have a connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
So go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's closer to 2 million now people in the United States have MS. So the number is growing, unfortunately. But I also think at the same time, you mentioned that there were maybe like 3 different therapies when you were diagnosed, and now there's, over 20 at this point. Yeah. So there's a bunch of different options as well too, and those are just in terms of pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of different options in physical therapy as well too. So I think just exploring that and finding out more solutions is going to be a key driver for just improving life for people with MS as well.
You bet. No, it's awesome that we're, again, 20 years ago there were 3 medications, and your choices are, which injectable do I use? Mm-hmm. How sick am I going to be? What are the side effects? Right. To now the discussion is around reversal and cure. I mean, those are common themes now when you look at, the discussions around MS. That's just, such a great stride. And I imagine a lot of that increase in numbers also comes with the ability to more quickly and definitively define whether a person has MS. Like, mine was pretty quick, but I've talked to others that it took a year, 2 years, 3 years before they could definitively say, yes, you've got MS. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a lot of studies going through. I've been in a couple of them. One of them just concluded earlier in the year. How many studies do you have going on at a time? Is it just one, or do you typically run a couple in your department?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in our lab specifically for our MS studies, we have, it sort of ebbs and flows, right? Because we have to do the study in terms of collect the data, we have to analyze all the data, and then sort of write up manuscripts and present our data as well too. So all those things sort of are in different phases and take different amounts of time. Right now we have the study that you were just in going on. I can speak more to that later. And then we also have 2 additional studies that are starting up probably in the early summer as well too. So we'll be pretty full rolling with 3 studies, 3 large studies going on as well soon. So yeah.
And so something I wanted to touch on, because it's an important piece. Obviously, to do these studies, you need to have volunteers like myself, like so many others. How easy is it for you to get folks to come in and do these studies? Is that a hard thing, or are people usually really willing? Like I love it. I love to be able to, if it's something that I qualify for and I can give back in this way, I think it's a great way for you folks to learn and further this cause. So talk about the kind of the process around getting volunteers.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the hardest things about doing research in humans is getting the human volunteers, for sure. And there's a lot of great research in mice as well too. There's a lot of different good models of MS in mice as well, and you can get really large amounts of mice pretty quickly in those things. But we're really interested in the human aspect of things, right? Because there's so many different things that just the human system has that make things different as well. Yeah. So for us, getting those volunteers is probably it's probably one of the harder things with the study. and just coordinating all of those things. I will say, because we have done so many MS studies, we have a pretty good rapport with the community. So we have a good list of people that will be in our studies most of the time, which is really good.
Yeah.
But we're always looking for more people as well too. So yeah,
It
we would
probably
love
helps to have
to.
a variety, right? Like if it's always just Bobby doing it. I mean, I do IT work, so if I test the same thing every time, I get the same result. I might not. I do need to vary that result out and test somebody with a different body composition, a different form of MS, whatever. That even if we're in the same kind of path, like we both have remitting, relapsing, or
Mhm.
both progressive or whatever, it's still different for each person.
Absolutely. It's extremely different person to person. That's one of the unique things about MS. If you have Parkinson's disease, for example, it's the exact same brain region that's affected for everybody, and their symptoms look mostly the same for the progression. Whereas MS, it's so broad in terms of this person might have sensory symptoms where they have numbness and tingling in their legs. One person might have more weakness. Some people don't have really any deficits in that area at all. They have more of a coordination issue, optic neuritis. There's a ton of different options for what symptoms
Yeah.
look like and what the combination of those is person to person. So we want to get as many people as possible so we really see the breadth of those different symptoms and how they affect the disease.
That's a good point. Like you said, Parkinson's is contained into one particular area, whereas MS just attacks your spinal cord, your brain. It's attacking the nervous system in many different areas, and
Yeah.
those lesions could be anywhere. And like you said, create different results.
Yeah.
Somebody once pointed out that the roadway example was a great way for me to explain MS to people when they say, "How does this work?" It's like having a road, and when you're driving down a brand new paved road, it's awesome. But then you start throwing potholes in, and then either avoiding the potholes, which you're not going down the path you want, or you're hitting the potholes and creating an issue. And that's what lesions are. They're these potholes in your nervous system that, when your brain is sending that message down to do something, it's not quite getting to the spot it needs to be, and it's creating these issues. So
Right. And it's a great example and one we've used before. And it's really like, you have these lesions or these potholes, and what happens to the message or the car is the car gets there and it gets there a lot slower, which is a problem by itself.
Yep.
And it gets there damaged as well too. So the message isn't quite as clear, depending on where it's going as well too. So yeah, it's a great example and a great way to think about MS.
And how many lesions are there? Just again, that creates the bigger issue. So we talked about the studies that I've been in. Let's talk about the current one that I just did. Just maybe we dive a little deeper into. You mentioned it kind of in the upfront, kind of what you do and what you study there. But let's talk about the study that I just did, which involved that some cranial and some other cool terms that you mentioned before that you'll mention again now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the study we're currently working on is looking more at the rehab side of things. We have some studies that are interested in how does MS work and what does function look like for people with MS. And this is one of our studies we're looking at how can we actually improve the symptoms of people with MS. So what we have a treadmill that has two different belts. So we can make each belt go different speeds, which sounds super goofy, but it's actually been shown to be pretty effective in other populations at improving what we call gait asymmetry, or sort of that difference that some people with MS have between their left and their right leg. Sometimes one person has a weaker left leg or a weaker right leg, and one other leg sort of guides their walking. And we see that pretty commonly in people with MS. So what we are doing currently is we're sort of training that bad leg to work more like the good leg by making it walk on a faster paced belt. We can sort of trick the nervous system into using some of its inherent abilities to adjust how our brain tells us to move, to make our brain tell our bad leg to work a little bit better, work a little bit harder. What this ends up doing is it makes somebody walk more symmetrically afterwards, which is really interesting. So we can do this for only 10 minutes is how long Bobby had to do it. And afterwards, we see sort of a difference in how they walk. And it's unique for each person because each person has a different level of asymmetry in their gait as well. And what we're also doing with this is we know that this is effective at improving symmetry in MS. We showed that in this previous study that Bobby was in. And now in this study, what we're doing is we're adding a couple more components. We're doing the same sort of treadmill training, but now we're going to have brain imaging on their head as well too. So we'll have them wear a mesh cap. We have people wear this that allows us to measure the activity in their brain. So we can see which regions of the brain are most important to actually make that right leg, or that left leg work harder. Additionally, we're using some sensory stimulation. So we have some little gel pads we can put on people's legs that improve the sensation of the legs to the brain. Think of it as getting a monster truck and going over those rows of those roads with potholes in them. So if we can add more signal and improve signal, we can probably improve how we're going to walk as well too. So we're adding those two elements to it as well too, and seeing what the effect of those are, and seeing if we can maybe enhance how well someone can learn how to walk better and make it last longer in their life as well.
Yeah. And I can attest, it definitely feels goofy. If anybody out there watching knows Monty Python and their Ministry of Silly Walks, the minute you get off that first 10 minutes with the asymmetrical tread, your whatever leg is predominantly faster does feel like it's moving in a really weird way, and it takes a minute to adjust. Like you said, probably different for everybody. So, but yeah, you could start to see like the immediate benefits, like because you said so many people have this issue. I don't have it all the time, but when my MS is flaring up, I definitely, or if I'm tired, I do feel a predominance in my walk, and I can feel one leg pulling faster than the other. But I notice it. People don't typically notice it, but I do. And so I could, for somebody who's got a even more enhanced, a potential issue with that, this could be a pretty huge advancement to be able to do something to improve that. So yeah, that's awesome. Any other studies? So you talked about the two coming up. Can you talk anything about those that are coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so with that last one, what's really interesting is we're trying to think of what are some longer term ways we can actually improve walking in people with MS. By more of this rehabilitation technique, right? So we also go at a couple different avenues as well too. So another study that actually is explained very well by your roads analogy, there's a bunch of different pathways or roads that go from our brain down to our spinal cord and then into our body. And there are some roads that are actually more affected by MS than other ones, most commonly. So we've shown through previous studies that some of the roads or the neurons in the brain that connect both hemispheres, so the left and right side together, are more affected in MS compared to other diseases, or just more affected in general in terms of how many lesions people with MS have in this region. That's important for telling us what areas are lesioned and what might be some of these causes for something like a gait asymmetry that people have. So what we're investigating with this next study is trying to understand what are the quality of the different roads in the nervous system. And we've targeted one specific area that seems to be less affected by MS, that is sort of like think of it as like a backup road that's common in the nervous system. We have a lot of redundancy. So we have multiple neurons that can do similar things. And we're trying to understand, can we sort of use this different road and sort of send our messages more that way? And will that make our messaging more productive as well too? So we're investigating the integrity of these different roads and seeing if they can be better targets for how people with MS move, and we can utilize those better.
So just so I understand that correctly, so you're saying there's a part of the nervous system that is predominantly less affected by MS. So when you look at it, it's like, hey, this one lobular area or whatever, we don't see as many lesions here, or none at all, or that's a phenomenon that is interesting, because why is it not attacking here, and can this be used in some way to learn more about how to protect the rest of the brain, perhaps, or the rest of the spinal cord?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Where we have some areas that are definitely more affected by MS in terms of their lesions than other areas. And we're trying to see in those areas that aren't as affected, what can we potentially do to improve those areas, or maybe utilize them better and understand them. Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the studies we have going on that's going to start up here pretty quickly. Another study that's pretty interesting is that we are currently looking at what does the menstrual cycle do in people with MS as well too. So we know, and there's sort of this emerging evidence in general, that the menstrual cycle is really important for general performance in athletes and anything else as well. But there seems to be differences in symptoms of MS during different phases of the menstrual cycle as well.
Okay.
So we're going to start up a study looking at women with MS, understanding, hey, what do symptoms look like? What does their fatigue look like? And we actually have some pretty interesting methods where we can actually sort of test fatigue pretty robustly as well. See, what does the menstrual cycle have an effect on it? What types of hormones can affect these things as well too? And see, maybe some of these things are targetable. One thing that's pretty interesting is that for a lot of women with MS, the state that they're in right after pregnancy is very, very protective of MS, and even during pregnancy. A lot of times people have a lot less symptoms than normal just because of that hormone balance as well. So we're trying to understand that more and understand what might be targetable from those things in terms of what types of hormones are maybe better for MS symptoms and what might be worse as well too.
And would that help with in developing potential drugs to improve symptoms to protect against future MS attacks, or what will be the outcome there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's definitely a little bit exploratory in its nature at this point, but it could be really useful for, yes, determining what drugs could be beneficial for MS, but even to what different hormone balances are beneficial for MS. So maybe
Mm.
certain types of hormone balances or certain types of hormones are worse for MS and worse for MS remission as well too, and relapses as well.
Yeah.
So maybe we can understand better, hey, do these hormones have an effect on sort of this overall autoimmune response that's happening in MS? And if we can better understand those things, we can probably better understand MS and have better targets for treatment as well too.
Yeah. This is just a left field question, and if you don't know the answer, no problem. But I just thought of it. When it comes to fatigue, like I know that if I don't get enough sleep, my MS symptoms flare up a bit. Not a full on attack or anything, but what
Mhm.
about fatigue makes the body, makes the MS worse? Like any thought on that?
It's a great question. Fatigue is very, very multifaceted. We have fatigue of multiple types. We have fatigue at the muscle level. We also have fatigue just in general in the nervous system and how well the brain is sending signals to those muscles as well too. Most common in people with MS, it's sort of that nervous system fatigue, but sort of both of those can happen and they sort of kind of combine together. The weaker the nervous system gets in terms of its fatigue, that also affects the muscles as well too. If we can't activate them as well, they get fatigued more easily. So the aspect of fatigue that's really interesting is that it sort of has this longitudinal effect where sort of the more fatigue we're getting, the harder it is to move, and then the harder it is to move, which is really important. The more we exercise in MS specifically, it's really important for symptoms and keeping MS in remission more than it is relapsing as well too. We see that it's sort of multifaceted, and the more you're fatigued, the less you're going to want to move and be able to move effectively, and then that leads to a host of more symptoms that also introduce more fatigue as well too.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. Any other studies that outside of say CSU that you are aware of? Well, actually, let me back up and ask you a question I thought of before. So you've
Yeah.
been doing this a while. Looking back, are there studies that you've done completed that you're now seeing some benefit, some results from that are moving forward, or a study that you did that you felt was particularly impactful?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. I think in general, so one study that I wasn't directly involved with completely in this lab, but it was looking at, we do a lot of MRI scans as well too. So I'll have people sit in an MRI scanner and get their brain scanned and see what their lesions look like for one, but also what do certain areas of the brain look like in general. So I
Hmm.
mentioned that there was, we worked on a study where we could see that the areas that connect both hemispheres of the brain were really impacted in general. That was
Hmm.
sort of one of the first times that has been suggested in MS. So that was a really cool study to be a part of and sort of see those results. And
Yeah.
publishing those and presenting those has been impactful for other researchers in the field as well too, to have them have a better understanding of if these regions are more impacted, how does that impact how I'm going to do my research as well too.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's that sometimes it's not always like leading to a cure or a drug, but it could just be, it's just a building block in a bigger overall holistic research picture that this research over here helped this person to realize something that was maybe the one piece they needed to move this thing forward, which then came over here and eventually led to something much different. But
For sure. And I think just in general too, off of that, like research is really important because not necessarily each study is going to cure MS, right? But it's this overall collective knowledge that we're gaining as humans, but also as researchers that really helps us, take these little pieces of information from each study to be able to make something like a cure for MS. Because something like that's not going to come from one study that, we fund this one study and this is a really good one, so that one's going to be the cure for MS. It really is
right,
a combination of years of research all together, and sort of combining all these little nuggets of information we learn from each study helps us understand better what what's happening in MS and how we can target it the best. So
yeah.
it's really this collective effort by research to improve MS in general, rather than just one individual lab or one individual research study as well.
Yeah, because I mean, there's so much good work going on all over the place. You have a great lab here. The University of Colorado has a really good
Mhm.
MS focused lab. So yeah,
Yep.
just a lot of across the country, everybody connecting. A couple years ago, I was at a conference for MS, and they had a really neat exhibit with um, 30 to 50. It was a number of different labs from around the world. Actually, there was a few that were out of country that had come to present different research topics, including the first study that I was in at CSU. I forget the gentleman that was there, but I believe he's one of the folks in your department there. Was there to talk about that first study, which was some of the walking and also some of the brain activity around. If I'm not mistaken, we were trying to figure out what area of the brain stimulated different parts of the hand and movement, so you could figure out kind of that pathway to use that information. So it's amazing the collective work, like you said, that's going on, that's uplifting kind of all boats to a better understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another study that was really impactful, the first study you did with me as well too, where we had you walk on the treadmill with the belts going different speeds. And this was really cool because people have done this in stroke, a decent amount of research. And stroke is very much so, if you get a stroke on one side of your head, the other side is going to be pretty affected, right? Where MS, the lesions are sort of mixed in there. So it's a little bit harder to determine which side's going to be worse and better. But our study was sort of the first one to actually determine that, hey, this is actually really effective in MS as well too. And a lot of times we see that people with MS or even older adults as well too, there might be a difference in how fast or how much they can adapt. But even with all those blockages in the way, the brain still has the ability to do this very complex type of adjustment of how we're going to move as well too. We also found that there's different strategies that people use as well too. So some people are going to adapt how big their steps are, and some people will more adapt the timing of their steps, how fast they're stepping compared to the other step. So that sort of dichotomy is really interesting as well. And we think that some of the brain activity measurements that we're taking right now might be informative of how people adapt as well too, which will be pretty interesting to us to see.
Gotcha. So again, building off of that first study into this one and learning back and forth on each of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just in kind of on the same topic, I was interested in knowing, something came across my, my email, or maybe we were talking about it, but a lot of what we do as fundraisers in the community, whether it's Bike MS, Walk MS, Hike MS, all the different, fundraising that goes on out there, it goes into a lot of different places, but it's funding research like yours directly. So I just want to talk a little bit about, number one, maybe if you can, just kind of what the process is for you to get the funding.
Yeah.
And then, kind of once you do, put it out there, how much that impacts you when you do get funding from the society and all the efforts of the folks out there who are donating, in these micro and macro amounts.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Because sometimes it feels like your money might go into a black box. You're not sure what happens with it, but we can definitely tell you exactly what it looks like for us. So we've been fully funded by the MS Society for around 8 years now. So all of our research we've been doing has been fully from the MS Society. And what it looks like in terms of obtaining research funding from the MS Society, they have actually a good number of research grants. The MS Society does have a large focus on research, which is great. And usually you have to apply for them, right? So what you typically have to do, and what we have done in the past for multiple times now, is we submit an application of, hey, we have this idea. We think that this treadmill training routine can help people with MS and how they walk, for example. So we put together a proposal on, hey, we think that this might be helpful for people with MS or help us understand MS better for these following reasons. So you write up a big proposal on why we think this could be helpful. And then they can assign us funding based on how that looks for them. If they think it's really interesting and a priority of them, they'll likely fund it. And what that looks like is the money actually goes to not only getting research equipment, but paying participants that come in here, paying people like me my small stipend that I get as a PhD student in terms of paying actually the people to do the research as well too. But that funding has been sort of all of our MS research that we've done in the last 8 years has been coming from them. So yeah, I mean, to everybody that has donated to the MS Society or participated in Bike or Walk or Hike MS, all those things are super beneficial and are going towards real MS work, which is really impactful.
Yeah,
we're going to have, we are doing Bike MS this year. The MS Society is also doing lab tours in our lab at the end of the race as well too. So
That's
anybody
awesome.
is invited. So sort of right where that race ends, it's a big field. Our
Yep.
lab is probably about 30 feet from that field in terms of where the building is. So
Yeah.
some process with the National MS Society and how it all work. But we're going to do lab tours and try to talk to people about, hey, what do we do in our research lab with National MS Society? So that'll be an
Well,
opportunity as well too.
that's a great touch. I love that. I mean, it gets people excited. I mean, for the longest time, I got involved right away in fundraising and stuff, and then later on, I started finding these opportunities. As Zoom and meet, online meetings came about, and love sitting in on, just listening in the room when smart folks like you and doctors are talking about subjects. I'm, at the time I'm writing down things I've never heard of, but I can go back and look. That I'd love to hear this kind of crosstalk and so being able to see that too and be able to, like you said, to feel it and just really puts a perspective on what those folks that are doing. It's like, hey, I just rode 75 miles, likely maybe more, or
Mm-hmm.
slightly less to get here, and now I can actually see what the impact value I'm having, and I can also then in turn tell my, the people that have donated to me, yeah, this is real. Like you said, this is real. This money isn't going into a vacuum. The MS Society is one of the better charity organizations when it comes to distributing their funds. They do, they really high marks for how they distribute and what they use it for. So again, just really cool to hear how, just your personal experience with that and getting to get a little bit of the background on that is awesome. I was going to ask a follow up. When you do the proposal, like when we've got this idea, is that presented in person or is it just online? What's that process like when you actually go to actually you submit it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's really dependent on a lot of different things, and it depends on where you're submitting these proposals. These grant proposals are pretty common in research in general, and they all come from a bunch of different places. So the MS Society has done things similar to other places as well too. Usually, this it sort of covers a couple different areas, but the overall strategy of the research. How do you want this research to look? What specific things are you going to do to incorporate that? The impact of the research and why you're qualified to do the research in general. Will you make it successful? All these things are factors in how it's scored. So you'll sort of submit this on like an online portal. So it will just be some documents, and it'll all get scored based on some scientific reviewers as well too, on the quality of how good the study could be and the potential of it. So it's a pretty lengthy review process, but usually there's a few different factors that are important to the MS Society in particular on how they decide who gets the funding and who doesn't.
Cool, man. That's good stuff. Anything else that I haven't covered that you think would be important for folks to know about kind of how this side of the process works from a research to, again, from the point of, requesting it, kind of germinating the idea around a particular study to following it all the way through. Anything we've missed in our discussion today?
I don't think so. I mean, one thing I would just leave people with is that research, it does feel sometimes that this, money's going into a vacuum and no progress is really happening, but it really is an MS. It really is. There are some fields where maybe it would feel like that more than others, but MS is definitely not one of those. There's more MS research now than there ever has been in history. People are really passionate about understanding how MS works, why is it different person to person, and what potential therapies can we have. So I would say just to be, I'm excited about MS research and that the things are coming from it, and that it's one of these areas where, we have this goal of a cure for MS for the National MS Society in general and for bike MS. And like these things are actually possible. These things are actually possible in terms of what we mean by a cure and these things that are happening in research. I would just be excited about the future of research in MS. That's what I would say.
Awesome, man. Well, I know we appreciate you and your crew and what you're doing there. And before I let you go, it's been a tradition on the podcast. And to be fair, I've carried it over from my work podcast into this one, but we'd love to throw a couple of quick, fun questions at the end just to get a fun, kind of ending feel. So I'm just gonna throw some rapid fire questions at you, and we'll see where we get. I'll answer them as well, just as we go through it. But here we go. Favorite character in the Breaking Bad universe?
Oh, wow. This is great. I love Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Fantastic shows. I was going to go with Jesse Pinkman. I think he has been the most interesting. I think his character arc has been very interesting throughout the series as well too. So
Yeah.
Great question. Fantastic.
He's a good one. Like I said, the characters in the show are all so cool. This is
Mhm.
going to be crazy, but I felt like one of my favorite characters. I like Jesse a lot, but is it Lalo? Is that right?
Yeah,
Is that
Lalo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Lalo? He was one of my favorites because he was so kind of fair but crazy. I mean, and he
Mhm.
was charismatic and just it was like he was so off the wall on one side, but then sometimes really fair and kind of even. I was like, I kind of get this guy. He's
Yeah.
kind of a fun character. I would imagine a fun character to play and build. And Jesse, like you said, just he's also a great, fun character. I haven't yet seen I've watched the whole thing. I've yet to watch the movie.
Yeah.
What's it called? El Camino. I've got to
Yeah.
get that one. Yeah, that's kind of next on my list. All right. Well, see, this one I'm not even sure if this is a thing, but what's the strangest place you've seen Cam the Ram?
Oh, it's a great question. He does show up to a lot of places, actually.
Does
The strangest place I've seen him, I don't know. That's a good question. He's definitely around on campus for sure. Any
Yeah.
sort of event that's happening, he'll probably be there, which is fun.
Yeah.
So I've seen him in like the performing arts center that we have at the Laurie Student Center. That's
Yeah.
probably the goofiest place I've seen him before. But he's at the football stadium, at the basketball Moby Arena often as well too. But yeah, he's very active, I would say, on campus.
Right on. It's just like all the time, every day. And is it one person? Do you know? Or is it? Do you know if multiple people do it?
I have no idea.
Are you Cam the Ram? Can we unveil anything here today?
That's a great question. I have no idea.
You are, yeah.
People. It could be me. I don't know, but
We don't know. We're gonna leave it at that.
Leave it at that.
I'll leave one last thing. What's your favorite? If it just something out of the way. Anybody visiting Fort Collins, your favorite eatery or place you've got to go to? Whether it's food, beer, record store, whatever. What's the one place if you're in Fort Collins you got to stop at?
That's a great question. I would say if there's only one, New Belgium Brewing is like the most popular thing to do. And it's honestly probably for a good reason. It's just a great environment, great beers. But honestly too, like there's a ton of different really cool breweries in Fort Collins. So I recommend going to a bunch of them. So there's a bunch of different like brewery, different crawl type of things that are fun in terms of go to a brewery and try different things as well too. So I would just say the brewery scene in general. That's probably my favorite. Fort Collins.
New Belgium's got a really cool campus. I mean, it's like it's not even just a brewery; it's like a whole campus. I'm lucky in that the industry I work in is a Microsoft financial software system, and New Belgium uses that system. So they've hosted us for user group meetings a couple times. So I've got the behind the scenes tours a couple times and sat in their little brew house. Have you been inside before? They got a slide. In the employee area, they got the slide that goes down. It's like a circular slide that goes down.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool. Yeah, if you can do the tour, it's a great thing to do as well, too. Absolutely.
Yep. Cool, man. Well, again, I appreciate it. Enjoyed having you on, and like I said, appreciate your time, and hope to see you again at somewhere along the lines at the next study, or albeit up in Fort Collins for the ride in June. Yeah, definitely. We'll encourage people to go take the tour because I think that's just a really cool touch. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you, again, being on here. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. And thank you to all you out there watching. And we'll see you again next time.
All right. Thanks so much, Bobby. Thanks for having me.
You bet.